what I wanted to do is, and I'm not going to, I guess I can't, you know, play all these videos because we are starting to get short on time, but the main subject line of today's show is Sagnac, Einstein, and the hidden ether. And what I kind of wanted to talk about is I want to take everybody back, you know, in history a bit to look at some of the early experiments that were done to detect not only the movement of the Earth, but they can also be readily applied to any curvature in the Earth. And most people have heard of the Michelson-Morley experiment. A lot of people have heard of Airy's failure. A lot of people have heard of Sagnac's experiment, and they may or may not know, you know, what they're all about. I mean, people have heard of it, but so what I want to do, and the reason I'm going back in history is because I want to bring this forward to a piece of modern technology that we use today, and something that I believe is going to help us prove without a doubt, not only once again that the Earth is not spinning, but that there is no curvature to the Earth either. So I'll start off by saying that science for centuries before, you know, 500 years ago or whatever, or even up to 500 years ago, has always accepted the idea of an ether. Okay, so what is an ether? Well, an ether actually is defined, interestingly enough, in the dictionary. They actually refer to it as being an atmosphere, and I suppose you could look at it that way, but that is certainly not the context that it was being presented in when Sagnac and Michelson-Morley and Airy were doing their experiments. The ether, in the terms that we're going to be discussing it today, does not, first of all, does not require an atmosphere. And a lot of people, you know, ask the questions, can light propagate in a vacuum? Can radio waves propagate in a vacuum? The answer to that question is yes, absolutely they can. It does not require an atmosphere or anything like that for light or radio waves to propagate. However, because light is a wave, and because radio waves are waves, there has to be, you know, by the very definition of what they are, there has to be a medium in which these light waves and radio waves are propagating through. This is the mysterious substance, or whatever you want to call it, called the ether. Now, there are a few different takes on the ether. For example, as I pointed out on our show last week, Jaron, there are people that don't believe that the ether exists still to this day, but rather they call it, you know, a primary element, primary elements. But the bottom line is they're calling it a medium. Okay, now what that medium is obviously a topic for debate, and science clearly doesn't know what it is, I don't think either, but they certainly take advantage of its existence, right? It's kind of like science doesn't really know what electricity is either, but we can, you know, harness it, we can calculate it, we can do a lot of things with it, but as far as defining what it actually is, well, that gets a little bit in the murky side. Walter Russell, by the way. Yeah, theoretical side, absolutely. Walter Russell was the one that basically is never believed in an ether, and he was the one that said that it was essentially, you know, the first three elements on our table, or a prior three elements, you know, or that should be there. And I'm not going to go into all the details about that because, frankly, I'm not sure about it myself. I would have to do a lot more study on Walter Russell. But so what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about this ether, whatever it is that waves propagate through, and you know, light propagates through, and radio waves propagate through. And there were several experiments that were done, you know, proving the ether. For example, Airy's failure, which, you know, this experiment in particular, the idea was to determine whether or not the Earth was moving through the ether, or whether the starlight was propagating with the ether coming in from above. So what Airy did is he devised an experiment where he had a telescope, and he basically was able to determine that it was in fact the starlight that was coming in, and it was the stars that were moving, bringing the starlight in to a stationary Earth. Now, I will be the first one to tell people that this subject is hotly up for debate, and frankly, it's the con side to the Aether is a lot of smoke and mirrors logic, and like I said, there's tons of material on it. I'm using Malcolm Bowden's specific information here because he makes it very simple to understand. But so I guess what I could do is I could, play a little bit of this, a minute or two, and you can kind of get an idea of what's going on with it, and then we'll kind of go forward from there.
Real quick.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say real quick, Malcolm Bowden is not a flat earther. He vehemently denies it, but he's done some great work on the geocentric model. And just wanted to mention that there's several people in the chat mentioning that they're having trouble with the video stream. So if you can hear this, but you can't see us, maybe you try updating your Flash player or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because I'm watching the live feed and it looks like it's fine.
Me too.
Solid as a rock. So, all right, so let's go through this just a little bit. And this is Malcolm Bowden. I mean, you're right. He's not a flat earther. He's against flat Earth, but he is a geocentrist. And it's interesting because his experiments tell me that he should be able to logically deduce that, the Earth is flat from that, but I'm not going to speak for him. So let's play this a little bit.
In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path but is only traveling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further. In 1871, George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, performed this experiment. This is a copy from his original report. You can see that the two readings are virtually identical.
All right, so the point to this is that the results of this experiment were that the telescope turned out to be stationary and it was indeed the starlight that was moving in, okay? This was obviously, when Airy did it, it was a replication of the previous professor that had done it. So it has been verified by repeatability. And it's interesting because since then they have tried to come out with a few different explanations, trying to invert this whole idea again and say, no, 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 it was really the Earth that's moving. And this is where it really gets interesting, but you have to go into it and read this and watch other people and the way that they debunk it. It is so pathetic, it's beyond belief, but I'm not going to go into that here. I just want to point this stuff out to you so that it gives you a point to start studying this and researching it. So basically what happened, so Aries, you know, this was called Aries failure because essentially it showed that it was indeed the stars moving and not the Earth, and science simply couldn't accept that. So around 1887, the Michelson-Morley experiment came about. And by the way, this is an experiment that is documented well by a few people. It's also in the Principle, they talk about it. The Principle movie, they talk about it. And so it went on the premise saying that, you know, the existence of a special medium in space called the ether was well known and accepted by science for hundreds of years. So a hypothesis was made that if a single light beam was split into two light beams, and then each beam was projected at right angles from each other, okay, in this experiment, and one of them was in the directions of the Earth's spin, while the Earth was allegedly moving at 30 kilometers per second. Okay, now let me tell you first of all that 30 kilometers per second is equivalent to 67,000 miles an hour. So the Michelson-Morley experiment was actually not necessarily just trying to look at the rotation of the Earth, but the movement of the Earth around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour, okay, which breaks down to 30 kilometers per second. And the premise is that if the Earth was allegedly moving at 30 kilometers, there would be a phase or a time delay difference in the two beams shown on an interferometer. And what an interferometer basically does is it shows interference patterns in waves. And I won't go into that, you know, in too much detail. I do have a video that kind of explains it a little bit. But they were expecting to see a phase or a time delay difference between the two beams once they were recombined, and that would prove the forward motion of the Earth through the ether. So what happened is the experiment returned what's called a null result, which is just scientific, you know, jargon saying that the velocity of the Earth was none other than 0. Okay, so obviously that was something that once again science couldn't accept, and they really didn't know, you know, how to deal with that. So, and it's interesting because I thought about that for a while, and it's like, well, if they were only looking for a forward velocity of 30 kilometers or 67,000 miles per hour, which is the speed of the Earth around the sun, that's odd because they didn't seem to take in all the other fantastic motions. So all I could say is apparently science must have been unaware or simply hadn't made up the velocity of the sun around the solar system yet, or the solar system around the galaxy, or the galaxy around the Great Attractor yet, right? Because obviously those velocities technically should have been much, much, much faster even than 30 kilometers per second. But the bottom line is the velocities returned at 0, even though there were several different angular velocities and linear velocities going on. So basically after this occurred, the scientism establishment brought forth the explanation from two other very prominent physicists, excuse me. One guy named Hendrik Lorentz and another guy named George Fitzgerald, okay? And they advanced an idea that was so preposterous, trying to explain the Michelson-Morley experiment. They said that the reason that happened was because the solid steel arm that was pointed in the direction of the Earth's travel, right, 67,000 miles an hour, actually became shorter as it passed through the ether. like because we're moving, we're actually becoming you know, shorter, or we're being contracted. So this farce basically became known as the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction, and most physicists just defined it as a physics of desperation. It was pretty much laughed out and discredited. So the scientific community then was in quite a conundrum, because they had to, you know, get away from the idea that the Earth was the stationary center of the universe. So then Albert Einstein, old one stone himself, comes in with his solution, and what he did was he created, of course, the theory of special relativity, which mathematically and only mathematically abolished the existence of the ether. Okay, he had no evidence whatsoever to do that, other than his special relativistic equations, and he did this in around 1905, right? So great, everybody's happy. You know, the Earth's no longer the center of the universe. And then in 1913, Sagnac came out with another experiment that was kind of a variation of the Michelson-Morley experiment, that was intended to prove that the ether did indeed exist, because, you know, the idea that, you know, Einstein just simply coming out and summarily dismissing it was absurd, and most of the scientific community knew that. So what happened is he did his experiment, and I'm also going to run this for just a couple minutes, about 5 minutes. And believe me, there is a point to all this, guys. I'm getting to it, and I'm trying to hurry through this so that, you know, we have a little bit of time for Robbie and Brian. So I'm going to play this video, which is also by Malcolm Bowden, who is a physics professor and a PhD, obviously. And we will hear him describe what's going on with Sagnac, and also what the modern rebuttal to that is through Wikipedia. And so take a listen to this. And I go here.
In 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment of passing light in opposite directions around a table and recombining them. This produced interference fringes. He then rotated the whole table at 2 revolutions per second and found that the fringes changed. This result has very significant implications in science. It works as follows. A beam of light leaves the light source at the bottom left-hand corner and is split into 2 different beams, which we have colored red and blue just to distinguish them. They travel around the circuit in opposite directions until they eventually reach the splitter, which also recombines them. There, they then go on to the photographic plate, where they have interference fringes. In this simplified version, we see that the beam is split into 2, the red and the blue again, and they go around the circuit and are recombined at the splitter and recombining prism, so that they again produce the fringes on the photographic plate. Now let us rotate the table. Before we do so, there is the very important subject of the effect of the ether. The Michelson-Morley experiment failed to detect the 30 kilometers per second motion of the Earth through the ether. So to overcome this problem, Einstein simply abolished the ether in his relativity theory. The very significant result of the Sagnac experiment was that it proved that the ether existed. Let us see how it did this. It is a fundamental feature of relativity that it claims that as there is no ether, light travels away from a source at the same speed relative to the source, whether the source is moving or not. Thus, whether the table is turning or not, the fringe patterns should stay the same. But if the ether exists, once the light has left the source, the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the speed of the table, mirrors, etc., as we see here. So let us see what happens when we rotate the table. Here, the light is split, and the red and blue lights go in opposite directions. But notice that the left-hand mirror has moved around in such a direction that the distance the red light has to travel is further, Now in relativity, the same time should be taken because the splitter is also moving and the distance between them is the same. But now imagine that the ether exists and the speed of the light is controlled by the stationary ether. Imagine the ether like a thick treacle that limits how fast the light can travel, independent of the motion of the light source, the splitter, or the mirrors. The result is that the red light takes longer to reach the left-hand mirror. Similarly, the right-hand mirror is coming towards the blue light, so it reaches the mirror quicker. After they change ends, the red light again takes longer to reach the recombiner, whilst the blue light gets there quicker again. So they reach the photographic plate with a delay between them, and this changes the fringe pattern. In fact, Sagnac, using the speed of the rotation of the table, calculated how much the fringes should change, and found that they did change by just that amount. The crucial feature of this experiment is that it demonstrates that the ether does exist, which demolishes relativity. How does the scientific establishment deal with this result? By muddying the waters with scientific gobbledygook. Wikipedia says, in the above discussion, the rotation mentioned is a rotation with respect to an inertial reference frame. Since this experiment does not involve a relativistic velocity, the same wording is valid both in the context of classical electrodynamics and special relativity. How on earth can it be valid in both theories? It clearly proves that the ether exists because the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the rotating table and mirrors. This Sagnac effect is used by airlines for their compass directions. As the plane turns, the change in the fringes are translated into a change in the direction of the plane that then registers on the cockpit compass.
All right. So there you have it. Now, the reason, of course, that we bring this up is because Malcolm isn't wrong about this. The experiment definitely conclusively proves that there is an ether amongst many others. That it also conclusively proves, in my mind, that Einstein's relativity theory is complete hogwash, and of course a lot of other physicists absolutely believe that as well. Of course, the mainstream still promotes Einstein and his relativity theory, to this day, even though it wasn't his, but we won't go there. In fact, it was not only written by his wife, but it was also proposed several years earlier by a few other scientists, including the equals MC square formula and derivations, but I digress. So Malcolm is correct. Without the existence of the ether, this Sagnac effect could not work, okay? So what was he talking about? He's like, well, airlines are using this Sagnac effect in a piece of equipment that they use to this day. In fact, the ring laser gyro is the very thing that makes an inertial navigation system, an INS, into an inertial reference system, the IRS, which is the updated version. Now, this, of course, takes into consideration the idea of the Schuler tuning, yada, 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 which, of course, was complete and utter nonsense. And they've since replaced that with Honeywell's Adiro unit. And this is something that we are going to cover in detail on a later show, but I don't want to get too technical, during this show. So, in fact, these ring laser gyroscopes absolutely do exist, and they openly state that they work using the Sagnac effect. Well, if the ether didn't exist, then the Sagnac effect couldn't work, right? So what we have today is we have these ring laser gyros that are being integrated into it, and when you watch the description of how these work, it's very similar to the exact experiment that Sagnac did. Okay, very, very similar.
It's about looks like a flux capacitor.
It does, doesn't it? So basically, I'm going to go over real quick how this works. It's a little bit different. The difference between a ring laser gyro and a standard gyroscope is, of course, a standard gyroscope is a mechanical device that uses gimbals, okay? And that is a gimbal type of mount system, where this uses I forgot the term they call it, but it's basically locked onto the aircraft itself. So what's happening here is you have an anode, this point right here, which is emitting 2 light beams. One light beam is going this way, and it's going, excuse me, a cathode. Cathode is emitting the light beam and going to 2 anodes. Okay, so what happened is it's emitting 2 beams. One is going this way to this anode, and one is going this way to this anode. All right, so theoretically, if you send a beam off, 2 beams at the same time, they're going to reach the anodes of this device at the same time. Now, this path is basically like a helium-argon gas that the laser or the coherent light is passing through. And by the way, these use coherent light lasers. And let me define what a coherent light laser is. It's a laser that, instead of being a strap-down system, thank you, Cami, strap-down system. All right, anyway, so the medium is a like helium argon or something like that the light is passing through to get to the anodes. Okay, so what happens then is, if nothing is moving, then they will reach these anodes at exactly the same time, and there will be no phase shift or phase differential detected between the 2 beams. However, if you launch these beams off at the same time and then rotate this slightly one way or the other, then, because of the Sagnac effect and the finite speed that is set through the ether, you will get an interference pattern or a phase differential detected in the 2 beams themselves. Okay, so this is the strap-down system, and the Sagnac system, or the ring laser gyro, is basically in a box, and they are set at 3 different axes. One is for pitch, one is for yaw, and one is for roll, and they all work precisely the same way. Okay, so where am I going with this? Well, the point behind this is that not only does this destroy Einstein's idea of relativity, but it proves Sagnac, and it also makes a gyroscope that does not have the limitations that are brought about by mechanical binding at the gimbal attachments. Okay, so one of the biggest complaints that the ball earthers are coming back with about the standard gyroscope experiments is they're saying that the precision gyroscopes that we're using today in the 21st century have too much of a mechanical binding effect to be able to detect the 0.000695 revolutions per minute of the Earth, right?
That's absurd.
That is absurd. It's absurd, absolutely. And because, remember, 170 years ago, Foucault supposedly did this with his crappy gyroscope, and he reported precession, thus, quote unquote, proving that the Earth was rotating. Well, great. So, what we have here now is we have something that is working with no moving parts. It's simply by a ring of light, which means that the sensitivity factor is literally unlimited. It's totally sensitive. And in fact, that is reflected by the Adiru calibration instructions that are brought out by Honeywell. Okay, Honeywell basically says, yeah, when you're calibrating this, you can't be moving. They don't even want passengers to be loading on the airplane because it's that sensitive, right? Little vibrations or loading luggage, anything like that. So what that tells us then is that in modern day aircraft, we are putting these ring laser gyros in virtually all of the commercial airliners, and every one of them has the capability, just by sitting on the runway or sitting on the tarmac, of detecting the motion of the Earth. Okay, so one would then say, well, then why don't you just do that, set them on the runway? Well, they're not going to detect any precession sitting on the runway, and the reason that they will tell you that it won't detect any precession is because the ADIRU unit, once calibrated, is then, and this is openly stated in the Honeywell training videos, and I will cover this in depth, but they're saying that because of the ADIRU system, it is compensating for that precession via its own mechanism of Schuler tuning, if you will, right? So it's supposedly compensating for it, and that you never will see anything while it's sitting on the plane. Well, that's all fine and dandy. So what I started doing is I started looking for, you know, the possibility of purchasing a ring laser gyro, and lo and behold, I found some things that you can actually get these things out of the ADIRU unit, you know, away from ADIRU unit where this compensation is supposedly taking place. And if we can get one of these and, you know, do like what Rob Durham said, basically just fire it up and let it sit there, it will tell us straight up whether or not the Earth is moving. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you go and you look at these ring laser gyros, a lot of people are out there doing homebrews of them, but they're not testing them using any sort of interference a fringe pattern, right? They're doing it and they're saying, oh, look, you're seeing a slight voltage change here, which is absolutely conclusively telling you that the rotation of the Earth is happening. Of course, there's a lot of other explanations for that. Again, I will debunk those in a future explanation. But so what I'm thinking is when I was looking around for these things, I was able to find them from anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000. So I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool, you know, if we couldn't find one, you know, somewhere like at an avionics shop where we could just go in and videotape a demonstration, if we actually purchased one of these separate and away from, you know, an ADIRU unit, which supposedly it takes away the rotation of the Earth, which compensates for it so the pilots would never see it. I know that's nonsense. Most of us here know that that's nonsense. In fact, we know that the ADIRU doesn't do that at all by the testimony of some of the airline pilots that we've had on not only MarkkSargent's show, but the guy that came on our show, which was also ATP rated, where they're telling the story where they were unable to calibrate the ADIRU unit. And so the solution from air traffic control after contacting Honeywell tech support is to simply call in to air traffic control for manual calibration inputs. And lo and behold, there was never a calibration input that made any difference. In other words, it was always zero. There was nothing they ever had to calibrate for. So that is a big hint right there. And that raised a lot of eyebrows in the airline pilots world, believe me. So if we can get one of these things, and like I said, they openly acknowledge that ring laser gyros are sensitive enough, absolutely. In fact, they tout it, that they're sensitive enough to detect the rotation of the Earth. But interestingly enough, you never actually see one of these ring laser gyros, other than the homebrew ones, in operation, you know, showing the rotation of the Earth, which to me, again, is another big eyebrow raiser, because if they're available in commercial aircraft and also some of the corporate planes, then that tells me that either nobody is even testing it, or they're just simply taking Honeywell's word for it.
Right.
So yeah, and you know, also real quick while we're on the subject, wouldn't that calibration be a variable that's depending on latitude and longitude and the time of day? Yeah, so you couldn't calibrate for that. Calibration only works if you're dealing with something that is non-variable. And that's, I mean, that's preposterous to say that the spinning sphere Earth is a non-variable, because it's constantly changing depending on your latitude and longitude, honestly, right?
Yes, and in fact, they tell you that, you know, when you're sitting anywhere near the equator, the calibration times only take about 5 minutes. But when you get up towards like the Arctic Circle latitudes or Antarctic or wherever, it can take as long as 20 to 25 minutes to calibrate these things, which of course, again, is horse pucky, because because the Earth isn't moving. And so there you have it. So the point is that, you know, we have devices in existence today that prove Einstein wrong, and the fact that this is just glossed over blows me away, right? How is this happening? It makes no sense that they're allowing this to happen, and frankly, I think it'd be really cool if we were able to crowdfund one. If we were unable to do this, I'm going to, get in touch with some people at DIA. I believe that Wolfie6020 is definitely no troll. I think that he is also very interested, although brainwashed. I think he's interested in finding the truth. And he has, being a corporate ATP, he has some really, really spectacular contacts that he may be able to help us out. And in fact, he has been extremely willing to do all kinds of experiments, even to the point of offering up 10 grand to financing a flight to Antarctica, where he and I would actually pilot the craft. Of course, I don't really feel like getting shot down, but it's a great idea, but I think we can probably prove that anyway. So I honestly believe that he could be a terrific asset to us at some point. We just have to reach him with what we're seeing and the logic that we're seeing. So he and I made some definite strides forward with the acknowledgement from him that I was correct in, not only my answers, but also my acknowledgement to him, which made him feel much better, that the latitude-longitude system simply will not work on a flat Earth map, which of course, logically, to me, I never even thought about that, because to me, that's so obvious, it's a no-brainer, right? So I didn't even think that that's really the point he was all hung up on. But then I find out after that what he's really hung up on is the WGS-84 flattened ellipsoid datum, which again, we're going to go into that in detail a little bit as well. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about this, that we do have this technology, and that's kind of a little bit of the history behind it. I will put all the links to these videos and all the research that I've done, and I will even put in some links to some dissenting opinions by a guy that a lot of people know by the name of Cool Hard Logic. Because the ballers really seem to think he's whiz bang on it, but when you watch how he debunks it, again, he starts going to straw man and ad hominem type of arguments, and he really blows it. Frankly, he really blows it. A lot of his stuff is really good as far as how he explains things, but when it comes to this, he really falls short. And I will definitely put those in the link as well. So that's what I wanted to say about that, and that's something I think is spectacular.